The start of 2024 has proved a rocky start for Square Enix, with the much anticipated and largely celebrated release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being equalled and recently outshone by news of poor sales of both the game and its predecessor, Final Fantasy XVI. And this has been compounded by the news of staff redundancies, tumbling share prices, and an overwhelming sense of managed decline at the company itself, which the latest CEO, Takashi Kiryu, has sought to assuage with candid statements about his future vision and trajectory. So, personally, I don't usually care too much about sales figures and that side of the games industry, but the Square situation at the moment can't really be ignored, and it does feel like, as Kiryu himself has stated, something of an existential situation for the company that I think could be attributed to both external and internal factors for a number of reasons. And it is something that I care about and pay attention to personally in this case, because I've been playing Square games for well over 20 years, so I am invested somewhat in the company. So I think the first thing to point out here is that recent Final Fantasy releases have been dealt a bad hand by their exclusivity to the PlayStation 5 and the external factors that have been bound up with that. So if we contextualise the situation since 2020, where we had the PS5 being released in the midst of the COVID pandemic, the scarcity of the console for over a year because of that, the price of the console compared to the number of exclusive titles offered on it, and some might even argue the outlandish size and design of the PS5, which had some gamers holding out in the hope of a slimline version down the line. So I think all of this sort of contributed to the comparatively smaller uptake of the PlayStation 5 compared to earlier generations. And this is the climate that both 2023's Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth have been released in the wake of, and continue to suffer from as the PS5 skims beneath its expected sales figures to this day. So across the board, there are discussions around the future of exclusivity, whether Final Fantasy, and indeed Square titles across the board, should be made console first. And this is something that actually affects a lot of Japanese companies, because they have generally always designed for console, owing to their market. For Rebirth in particular, being a sequel to the PlayStation 4's Final Fantasy VII Remake didn't help matters, and it may have detracted some of the initial adopters who hadn't played the first game in the remake trilogy. So it was always a weird expectation, I think, that the sales would do anything more than match remake sales in the first place. So with all of this accounted for, I do cut the games some slack to this end. I think they are strong entries to the Final Fantasy sort of saga, but the industry is in a very weird place at the moment. And in fact, the PlayStation 5's life cycle has been touted as being winding down soon. And that's one of the weirdest things I've experienced in over 20 years of gaming, because it doesn't feel like it's ever actually taken off. And aside from the two Final Fantasy games I've just mentioned, Tekken 8 and a game I got free with my PS5 console, I don't actually own any PS5 games. I just play titles from the PS Plus subscription, which are almost exclusively remasters of previous generation games. So, very strange climate for this generation of games consoles that I know a lot of audiences and a lot of gamers have mentioned. However, despite the status of PlayStation and the console market, let's turn to Square Enix itself now. And I recently released an episode discussing the merger of Squaresoft and Enix back in 2003, the repercussions that came from that, which, if you're interested, you can go and watch that episode. And I won't go back over all of those points here, but I do think some of the decisions made post-merger have finally caught up with the company, and they've been underlying ever since that merger took place. Firstly, there is the diversification of the company's portfolio, which in some respects I understand, and in others not so much. I mentioned in the earlier episode that I felt Square are spreading themselves too thin regarding the game genres and industries they're involved with. The acquisition of Taito Arcades, the quote marks polymorphic approach to game IPs, and of course the drive to acquire Western games studios and create Western style games, which seems like a strange move, and they've consistently played this balancing act between their traditional style games like Octopath, Bravely, and of course Dragon Quest, and I'd argue Nier and Drakengard in that as well. And they've balanced this with a push towards what they deem to be popular for Western audiences and Western style games. So Forspoken, Kingdom Hearts, and of course in recent years Final Fantasy, along with their publishing rights on Life is Strange, Tomb Raider, Hitman, and so on. Finally, there's the extremely controversial push into the NFT and AI markets, which haven't gone down particularly well with audiences. I'm not sure how many people have checked out the Symbiogenesis NFT game, but it looks horrible. So there is that too, and they seem to be rushing into things that actually the industry doesn't fully appreciate or has really considered in much depth yet. So overall, Square has aggressively pushed into several markets over the past 2 decades, acquiring studios, acquiring IPs, yet not seeming to have a solid grasp of what to do with them long term, or whether they align to the sorts of genres and games that the company is known for and its brand recognition. And while it's true that Squaresoft's successes in the late 90s gave them a solid foothold in global markets off the back of Final Fantasy, the subsequent pursuit of quantity over quality, the pursuit of polymorphic multimedia over consistency, which is not a dig at any particular game or IP, but it's just an inevitable compounding result of this approach, which the company has acknowledged. And as former president Yoichi Wada said, he wanted to squeeze all the juice out of a lemon, by which he meant their flagship games Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. So this approach that's been taking place over the course of the last couple of decades has negatively impacted the company, I think. And on this note, I think it's good to sort of take a step back and make a comparison to 2 other giants in the Japanese entertainment industry, which is Bandai Namco and Capcom, who have been consistent in their growth in the recent couple of years, their share price and their output. So Namco is probably the most comparable to Square Enix because it also had a major merger in the early 2000s. So Namco merged with Bandai. It spans a range of media from toys and arcades to gaming and entertainment. And it's created and acquired a number of IPs over the years, from Pac-Man to One Piece to Dragon Ball. And at the time of recording, it's in the top spot. It's in the top 3 biggest game publishers in Japan, behind only Sony and Nintendo. So, scratching the surface here as to how Namco Bandai operates compared to Square, I think we can see a couple of potential factors that may account for their consistent successes where Square have failed. So firstly, we have the corporate structure, and this is comparatively simplified, but more so than that, it's perhaps more important to consider the allocation of funds within these corporate sectors. So for example, funds are of course allocated to existing IPs, but also creating new IPs, but perhaps more importantly than that, even though it doesn't generate much revenue in and of itself, Namco plows a lot of money and resource into research and development too, who are responsible for digital innovation that go into creating their new games. And secondly, this may be more of a subjective observation, Namco tends to hold IPs which are first and foremost almost all uniquely, identifiably Japanese, and secondly, they are games that more often than not, you know what you are getting when you buy them. So they have this consistency and indeed quality bound up with this brand recognition. So Tekken, for example, it's a 1v1 fighting game. It's always been a 1v1 fighting game, and the fundamentals of that series have been consistent ever since the games were first released back in 1994. Turning to Capcom, we have another company that simplifies its gaming divisions, and in this instance we have 2 core divisions which are split up between global markets and Asian markets, and the latter of which is often termed as the division housing their traditional IPs. So this is quite an interesting way to structure themselves, and it's worth noting that after a notable slump a few years ago, Capcom has actually rocketed back to success, with the back-to-back successes of Devil May Cry 5, Resident Evil 7, and their Resident Evil remakes. And a huge number of their sales come from what's termed their legacy releases. So this includes the Resident Evil remakes, but also Street Fighter, Monster Hunter. Again, brand recognition, all of these traditional IPs that they hold and continue to invest in. Further to this, both Namco and Capcom have doubled down on internal investment. They've recently raised employee salaries by up to 30%. They've restructured to nurture creativity and quality above all else. And I think this has paid dividends in their releases in more recent years. So taking this really top-level view of two comparable companies, let's look back at Square and their trajectory and decisions over the past decade or two. So where Namco have invested in acquisitions and R&D to improve new and existing IPs that almost all exist within a sphere of Japanese entertainment, so anime IPs like One Piece and Dragon Ball, or Namco's homegrown IPs like Tekken, Square has branched into what we'd term Western-style acquisitions, and they hold titles like Tomb Raider, Gex, Life is Strange, and they've morphed some of its global-facing titles, like Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts, along with new releases like Forspoken, into what they presume to be Western-friendly games. Additionally, where Capcom have made gains by remaking some of their most popular titles, such as Resident Evil, which have all tracked quite closely to the originals in terms of narrative, character and atmosphere, but they've made strides in gameplay, Square have sought to reimagine their flagship title, Final Fantasy VII, in recent years, with expanded stories in both console, handheld and mobile spaces. So we had Crisis Core, we had Advent Children, Before Crisis, so on. So they've really kind of expounded upon that. And this has most recently culminated in the remake trilogy of Final Fantasy VII, that rather than going the Resident Evil route and updating gameplay but staying faithful to story, they've sought to reimagine and or sequelize the original game in an effort, I think, to appeal to both old and new fans. And arguably they haven't quite accommodated either in trying to do that. So from the outside looking in, it's hard finally to fully assess the issues internally of management structures, division structures and stuff like that within Square, but the simplification of their two comparable rivals in Namco and Capcom, the emphasis these rivals have on freedom to nurture and create internally, and most of all focus on quality with a double underline, rather than incessant acquisitions, releases and chasing trends such as NFTs without due research and consideration of the implications and the opportunities there. These seem to be the clear benefits of what Namco and Capcom are doing as opposed to Square. Finally, and again from a personal perspective, I think there is something to be said for both Capcom and Namco continuing to own and strengthen and celebrate their Japanese IPs and their Japanese kind of heritage within entertainment and games that they've had for a long time, rather than trying to pivot and move into quote marks Western style games. I think Square kind of underestimate slightly that fans invested in them in the first place because they enjoyed the style of their games, and this weird dissecting of their flagship titles where they make Dragon Quest for the Japanese audience and Final Fantasy for some abstract perception of what the West wants. I think that's been a very weird way to conduct their operations, along with the incessant focus on polymorphic content where, particularly with Final Fantasy, but some other titles too, we could argue that the brand name loses value because they've created loads of spin-offs and subsidiary games. And for example, not to pick on this particular game because I didn't mind it, but if we look at Final Fantasy Type O, as I say, I didn't mind the game, but did it need to be a Final Fantasy title? Or could it have been nurtured, had more time spent on it, and actually developed into a fresh IP unto itself? So these are the sorts of questions that Square should be asking itself when it comes to legacy games, its portfolio of IPs. And this leads me on to my final point, which is the creation of new IPs. And Square have known this for a long time. It's been mentioned in shareholder reports for at least a decade, but they need to wean themselves away from reliance on Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest for revenue generation, and they need to start making new games. But not simply making any new games, but they actually need to play to their strengths, play to the reason that they have brand recognition in the first place, and what has traditionally differentiated them in the market. And honestly, I think the model of what Capcom are doing is perhaps a really interesting way that Square could position themselves, segmenting their departments between old and new. And I want to stress, I don't mean Square should just start making turn-based JRPGs, but they should take stock, look at their back catalogues and their legacy IPs, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Drakengard, Nier, all of those and so on, and say, okay, why do these succeed? What are the core elements and themes of these IPs? Why do people love them? And how can this become a template for how we build out our new games in the future? And I think that's a really good start point for a turnaround, as I say, from the outside looking in. So, just to conclude with some cautious optimism on my part, this episode has been prompted by the recent news of restructuring and plummeting stocks at Square. However, these things have come as a result of Square's changing direction and their new midterm strategy, which was devised by Takashi Kiryu, and now he's starting to implement that strategy, so of course it's had a knock-on on the share price and stuff like that. But actually, if we read the shareholder reports of what he's attempting to do, I think it really does address some of these key things that I've raised here, and it does, in its own way, perhaps look to model itself on some of the comparisons I've made here with their competitors. The slimming down of the lineup, the selling off of Western studios, and investing internally in staff and creativity and quality. So these are all positive indicators for me, despite the loss of jobs, which is horrible. So I know there's a mix of reactions from audiences. Some have long since given up on Square, others are enjoying their games today. But if we recall Capcom being dismissed for their failings a decade ago, before turning it around and now becoming one of the most valuable Japanese games publishers, for Square Enix, I think we are potentially at the crest of a consequential change for the better, and it will be very interesting to observe what they do over the next 3 to 5 years.